Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we put the current development finance model in Africa under the spotlight. To what extent is it working for Africa? And to what extent is it not working for Africa? Development financing needs are huge and they're widening. And you'll be hearing a lot about this because that gap is getting bigger and running into hundreds of billions of dollars. Foreign direct investment is in decline. It's been declining for decades. Another yawning gap is access to green climate finance to help Africa, which is the majority of countries that are most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. This is the discussion we'll be having for the next 2 hours, during which we'll have a special presentation and then open up to a discussion by the panel. I'll be introducing the panel to you. And they'll be coming to you as well for your comments, for your questions, and any suggestions about how do we deal with this financing model? If it's not working for Africa, what needs to be done? This discussion is hosted by African Development Institute, the African Development Bank Group, and it's being held under the auspices of the Global Community of Practice. And that's Policy Dialogue series that we are beginning today. So many discussions are going to be had over the next coming days regarding this matter. Let me now introduce to you the panel, starting with, he's not here with us in the room, but Charles Bwama is a globally respected and executive with over 35 years of leadership experience in and outside of Africa. In fact, Bwama is a former senior vice president of the African Development Bank Group, and having previously served as at the bank in various capacities as vice president and chief financial officer, acting vice president and director of finance, and therefore he is pretty much across all these issues that we are discussing today and the journey the bank has been on in terms of that financing model we are talking about. We have Chris Chalmers, is the executive director for Italy, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands at the African Development Bank Group. He has held this position since August 2019, and previously he was the head of strategy at the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, that is DFID, where he led work on the UK's 2016 Bilateral Development Review and the 2015 UK Aid Strategy. And prior to that, Mr. Chalmers held various senior positions with Department of International Development in India and China. And he will be introducing our special guest today, Professor Stefan Dakum, who is a professor of economic policy at the Blattwich School of Government and the Economics Department at Oxford University. He is also director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, and he has written a book or published a book. You'll be hearing more about that shortly. So to do the right thing right now is to hand over to my colleague here, Chalmers, to introduce Professor Dakum.
Thank you very much, Solomon, for your introductory words there. And may I start by thanking all of our guests today for connecting into this dialogue. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Dakum, to speak with us today. Stefan and I first met each other, in fact, 10 years ago, when I was working with the UK's Department for International Development in our office in Beijing, and Stefan came out as the new chief economist of the UK's Department for International Development at that time on a month-long visit to China. And for those of you who have seen his book, Gambling on Development, I was very pleased to see that in the very first pages of that book, he describes the learning that we both achieved during that visit in some detail. Since then, it's been a real pleasure for me and an honor that I've heard Professor Dakum speak a number of times since then. And always when he gives his talks, he will come at issues in a way that has made me think differently about the key development issues and has made me question my own preconceptions. So I was very excited when I heard of the possibility of Stefan coming out to visit us here in Abidjan and to speak at the African Development Institute with the global community of practice. So without further ado, Professor Dakum is the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies and professor of economic policy at the University of Oxford. He, as we have heard, is the former chief economist of the UK's Department for International Development, and he was the development policy advisor to successive British foreign secretaries. And it's with pleasure that I hand the floor now to Professor Dakum.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much for the kind introduction, but definitely thank you very much all for giving me an opportunity to briefly talk to you. You know, it's a key topic to talk about. You know, how do we get development to finance, and what are the models and what are the opportunities that people are being offered and countries are being offered to finance their development? I will come at this from a slightly different angle, and I will use essentially some work I've been doing that has resulted in a book, and I'm just getting the slides projected that hopefully you can see now. I've been working on a book that talks to effectively successes, but also failures on the way we think about finance and the role we attribute to finance, not just in Africa, I should say. It's a book that actually tries to deal with the global experience of developing countries that try to actually take off in their development, move from very low income status further up and becoming richer and reducing their poverty. And I will come to development finance, but I will take you on a bit of a tour around to think about it. And okay, the background is that I have recently published a book, and it's a book that is not an academic book. It's not meant just for an academic audience, but it's building on the experiences I've had as a chief economist in DFID for many years, for 7 years, and working in the UK system on development at the time in an organization that definitely was deeply committed to development, but also an academic that has had the opportunity to study from various angles what's going on and trying to blend somehow not just what an academic does, which is usually answering very small questions really well, to actually more what you need from a policy point of view, to making sure that you have a bigger picture view on terms of what's happening in development. So while the title is grandiose and maybe the image that you can see is challenging and puzzling, I hope to take you briefly in the kind of 20 minutes that I have to actually explain a bit the thinking around it. And the starting point is very self-evident, you know, and I think most of you on the call, if not everybody, we are working around development because we're passionate about poverty reduction. We would like people to have a better standard of living and actually getting much better outcomes in all kinds of areas than they may currently have achieved. And of course, the world has had some quite remarkable successes in recent time. This is simply a picture presenting, you know, the number of extreme poor people using the World Bank definition. I know it's all flawed, but it's arguably the best we have, at least on a level of income poverty, to describe some of the evolution that's been happening in the world. And if you go back to 1990, we had probably not much under 2 billion people in that extreme poverty lens. And by 2018, the last year that we have the data from the World Bank available, you know, this has gone down quite dramatically to just over 500 million. Despite the fact that the world population has increased by 2.3 billion. Of course, we also know, and the red color is what happened in East Asia, the orange is what happened in South Asia. That's then, of course, each of them totally dominated by what happened in China and in India. We know there's been a lot of progress, and the blue is here, Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa. We do know that actually it's been a challenging some decades. Now, of course, the percentage of the population in extreme poverty in Africa has reduced considerably, but actually as a number, it's still creeping up. And COVID, of course, hasn't helped. World Bank will bring out figures in September, and the global number of the increase in global poverty is maybe something like 150 million, of which probably at least half would be actually in an African context. Now, that does mean it puts us back further in this whole thing. Now, there's a lot being said about the difference experienced in sub-Saharan Africa relative to Asia, but it's also in Africa, and that's actually one of the themes that I really want to pick up today, is that we've had differential experience. You know, lots of countries in Africa are very small, but for those who are a little bit larger, there were about 18 countries in sub-Saharan Africa in 1990 with a population that was more than 8 million and where more than 1 in 5 people was in extreme poverty. In this period, up to 2018, there's only 2 of them that have managed to halve the number of extreme poor in their countries, while a number of others, and I've listed them there, actually seem to have actually experienced a doubling of the number in extreme poverty. And the countries where that has been especially been clearest is in the DRC, actually also in Nigeria and Madagascar. Now, we can argue about these numbers forever, but the one thing we must accept that also on the continent, there's become a differentiation. Some countries that have managed to do something that I would call takeoff and actually been quite successful, and others that haven't really been able to do this. And if you start looking at GDP per capita, that's the kind of story we have globally as well, where some countries have actually managed to take off. Of course, we know China, but China is so exceptional in the extent that it has done this. But you have Indonesia that's persistently been doing this with a blip in 97 around the Asian crisis, but actually going back to the 1970s. You have India, Vietnam, you have Ghana actually then doing it as well in the last 2 decades. You have Ethiopia actually becoming the fastest growing economy, according to some data, at least at the IMF at some point between 2010 and 2019, while others like the DRC has been stagnating, and Nigeria is also not necessarily managing to get that growth trajectory going again. Now, it's a bit of that, these are old questions. Why do we get it in certain countries to happen, in other countries it doesn't happen? And I think it's an important question to keep on asking, not least that unlike maybe 20 years ago when there was a lot of research on that topic, a lot of countries hadn't quite done it, but we've had actually now 2 decades or 2 or 3 decades where a lot of countries that looked like staying behind actually started taking off. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Bangladesh, that actually was called as late as 1980 by Henry Kissinger's team, at time the foreign secretary, at that time already the former Secretary of State in the US, but he called it a basket case, a country that was going nowhere. And I remember my first essay in development economics was about Bangladesh being a basket case. And I said, yes, it is. It will never do anything. And now we look at it, 20 years of growth of 5 to 6% at least, and a massive reduction in poverty and very good development outcomes as well. So they found somehow, and it's also another thing is important. Bangladesh is quite a messy place. This is not a place that is with a clear, a leadership, an authoritarian leadership for many decades that does it in a particular way, or a very organized country with strong institutions. This is actually it's a relatively weak democracy and so a relatively weak state, and still it has achieved these things. So why is it that a country like Bangladesh has been able to do it and others haven't been able to do it, is what I'm asking. Of course, in development economics, there's a lot of people ask these questions, and you could have a long evening spending the time. Do you recognize all these authors? These are the big best-selling authors in economic development. I'm not saying these are the best thinkers, but I can assure you these are the ones who sell best. Okay, so these are the ones whose book a lot of people have read and clearly bought all over the world. These are the kind of books we have. So we have the Jeff Sachs's and the, and the Paul Collier's. We have the Why Nations Fail there, or the Dambisa Moyo of that date. And these have lots of different views that actually have. Now, when we read in these books, and a lot of people still buy them very clearly, these books, they tend to tell us what to do and what not to do. And it gives us kind of very clear advice. And in fact, the more I've read this kind of work, or the more I've read actually endless reports of the World Bank, I've probably written some of them, endless other reports, it doesn't seem to be as if we don't know, broadly speaking, the kind of things that countries should be doing. We have a reasonable sense of what growth and development, how it could be achieved. Now, these books have 2 competing diagnoses. So why doesn't it happen? Now, the first group is then like the Why Nations Fail type of thing, and say, get your institutions right. Now, of course, getting institutions right is an important thing. You know, we want to have the rule of law. We want to have clearly defined property rights for investors and that they know they can actually deal with their investment and so on. But a lot of that work now says more or less, well, it all is shaped in history. And so I find it very unsatisfactory when I have to go to a country and basically say, well, get your institutions right. And that comes down to, well, get your history right. And we can keep on saying is that, and of course it did, colonialism distorted institutions, but it then doesn't explain why Ghana, and at least for Rwanda or Ethiopia, definitely, and Ethiopia until quite recently, have done quite well, and why other countries don't seem to have been able to do this. Because they all have, in one way or another, history that is bearing on them. Of course, Ethiopia not a colonial state, but many others like Rwanda and Ghana are colonial states. And so simply telling you, get yourself another history is not very satisfactory to countries to deal with. It's also a little bit like, you know, if some countries had a good history and people would like to say China, oh, it had a good history of a centralized state, meritocratic bureaucracy, 2000 years of central taxation, you know, surely it has a really historically strong state. So, but why did it wait until 1979 to actually start growing again? So you have to ask yourself, well, what did they have to wait for? Why did Bangladesh wait to the 1980s to actually then doing these things, even though 10 years earlier that things? Well, why Ghana managed to find its mojo back in the 90s, while it actually didn't manage to do it before in the post-colonial time. So there's a lot of reasons you could have it, but I find it unsatisfactory. And the main point I want to make, policymakers have agency. And why things are changing is that there's clearly something to do with agency at some point happen. And the question you have to ask is not, the thing you'd have to do is not simply giving lists of the things that the policies that need to be done, but you have to ask yourself, well, why don't certain countries do reasonable economic policies, and why do other countries do reasonable economic policies? And that's actually where I really want to challenge. If we start looking at some of these countries, is that Bangladesh started doing more sensible things. It had a terrible mess coming out of its independence war in the early 70s, had a terrible mess of the 1970s, but it came out and actually started doing reasonably sensible things. And that included in Bangladesh, it basically stopped believing that the state could do everything. It allowed shape for the private sector there that allowed garments to emerge. Even though it's a very corrupt state, it didn't want to kill off the garment sector in the moment it started emerging. And meanwhile, it knew very well it couldn't do social sector. So it allowed NGOs to develop at a scale that no other country in the world will ever allow to develop. You know, there is, BRAC is now the largest NGO in the world. Which other country would ever allow Grameen and BRAC to become so big? You have to ask yourself that. That's because the state allowed it to do that. And it basically understood we can't quite do social sectors. And a lot of the social sector improvement has come from NGOs, often in fact funded by international aid. I think the UK may well have spent in the region of more than $1 billion in the last 15 years supporting BRAC together with the Australians. So the question you want to ask, why don't they? Now I have to be conscious of time, and let me move on for a moment. And I want to relate to your experience. It's not a current experience, and so don't get me wrong, but it is a past experience that is true. It's about 8 years ago. And I was, within a very short spell of time, invited both in the left-hand side, which is in Kinshasa in the Prime Minister's office, and on the right-hand side, that's a drawing of the Prime Minister's office in Ethiopia. And I was invited to come and visit. And in fact, what I wanted to do, they wanted to tell me, as chief economist of a major international aid agency, tell me about their development plans. So what they did in Kinshasa at the time, and I'm very careful to say that is the history, that's a different government from the current one. In fact, Ethiopia is also a different government from the current one. But I come there in the place, and I get the most perfect development plan presented in Kinshasa. I must say, you know, I've been marking with my red pen as an academic, I'd say really very high marks. 13, we're all men, 30 young men gave all the nice expression of every sector, what they should be doing. And I think people here in the bank here would be proud of it. In Washington, they would have been proud of it. I, as an academic, thought that's quite clever. All the things you want to do on getting health going, education going, investment climate, macroeconomic stability, industrial zones, all the things. But I do remember walking out and saying, you know what, I think nothing will ever happen here. And basically, I've been witness to a piece of theater. And in fact, none of these plans of the prime minister were ever implemented. Nothing is there ever to be seen from these plans at the time. The prime minister at the time, I repeat, that's not today. In Ethiopia, we had a similar idea. We were going to listen. In fact, there were some senior academics. Justin Lin from China came, Paul Collier from the UK came, Land Pritchard from the US, and we're all listening to the plans that they had. There was the Minister of Finance, Governor of the Central Bank, and all kinds of senior people there in the room. And they presented their economic plans. And all of us had lots of comments and kind of really worried with some of the things they were going to do. Put it simply, they were by no means perfect as plans. There were all kinds of things they were going to do, and we thought, ooh, you're probably going to get problems there on the balance of payments, or this is probably not going to be good for the financial market. There were all kinds of things that were imperfect. But we all came out of the room and we talked to each other and said, first of all, they're going to do this. And secondly, they may well succeed. And actually later on that decade, they were the fastest growing economy in the world. Now, I'm not saying they did it perfectly and they made a lot of errors, but actually it is a very striking thing. And I think that's the element that I want to make sure that we don't forget we need to explain. And it comes to me down to a little bit, and I will hurry up now, last 5, well, maybe just under 10 minutes, I will finish with this, is that, you know, it's worth thinking about, you know, what are states in every society we work in, our own society in the UK or in the US, in Europe, in many ways, states, and this is actually Douglas North, a famous economic historian that got a Nobel Prize, he basically says a state is fundamentally comes from trying to handle, first of all, a problem of violence by basically having a coalition that rather than fighting with each other, basically says we're going to actually have a way of controlling land, labor, and capital and access to valuable activities like trade, workshop, education. Now, why I mention that? Because he very well explains in a sense that most states and in the way they're run, and I will emphasize and I'll explain in a moment, including the UK or the US or an African state, it is typically people with power and influence that have a dominant coalition, and they make somehow ways at that moment of how they're going to control land, labor, capital, who gets preferential access to certain things and others, who can do certain things or not. And, you know, whatever our political system, it's not unhelpful to look at it as an elite power game. And that's in the book, I want to say, you know, the way to think about it is that in every country, there's an elite. And now that's not just the political leadership. That can be the business elite as well. That can be the major business players. That can be the major players in civil society, in universities, intellectuals. Indeed, I will challenge you. I think many of you are one way or another associated, many on the call here, one way or another in your society, shaping this, doing this. You may have had that experience or whatever. This is not elite in a negative sense only. It's those people who have some power, some influence to shape what a state looks like. And at the minimum, every state, to be a functioning state, has to be a coalition of peace and stability, but then it's more. Usually that deal that exists, implicit deal, that's not a social contract that everybody signs or a compact or something, but more an implicit political deal, an economic deal, is actually, it's usually about, you know, who at this moment in time, how do I control the state? You know, there's various ways of doing it. We can have democracies, we can have more autocratic states, but even within democracies, we have so many varieties. You know, money is immensely powerful in the US politics. It is less powerful in the UK, but it is a little bit powerful still. It is in different countries in a different way. Similarly, in African democracies, some it's more powerful than in other places. And that's a way of, you know, how the state is being controlled and who is influential. And of course, it's linked to an economic deal. In some places, and I would come from Belgium myself originally, look, if I want to be a senior civil servant in Belgium, I need to have a party card. I would have to be a member of one of the leading political parties. If I do it in Britain, actually just not. I have to be not a party member because in fact, it's important that I'm not. That's a different way of dealing with it. You can have states that are, most of the jobs are rewards for support during elections. You can think of the US system where 3,500 people get appointed in the civil service and senior levels after an election. Or you could see it anywhere else in the world where maybe jobs are being created for teachers because you supported me or whatever it is. I want to just say that every state has something there. There's no perfect state in the world. We all have a different way we're dealing with. And of course, some of them are maybe more kleptocratic. where it's all based on stealing from business or citizens to make yourself rich. In others, it may be more autocratic. In other places, it may be more democratic, but still may be corrupt. In other places, it's different. And we have all these variations that we can have. We can have clientelists and so on. And I want to emphasize, that's a global issue. This has nothing to do with Africa on its own. In fact, you are just like the rest of the world having a political economic deal. Why do I mention that? Because it becomes quite important if we want development. We must have an elite bargain, a political and economic deal that gives space for growth and development. And if there's not enough space for that, there's very little that can happen. And my contention in the book is that it is the fundamental feature of successful countries in very different ways, whether we go to China, to Bangladesh, or maybe Ghana since the 1990s, or Ethiopia since 2005, or Rwanda is since the middle of the 1990s, that actually somehow growth and development is a central part of what the government somehow wants to achieve. Sometimes as a source of legitimacy, think of in China in 1979, the state, there's a longer history there, but let's put it simply, the state was politically in a mess, and ideology had become a real hindrance on any progress. It became a source of keeping legitimacy and stability in the state, that the state had to grow. In Bangladesh, actually, it was also very unstable after the 1970s. There was a sense like we need to actually begin to do something. In Ghana, politically, it had become very unstable earlier, and they actually got somehow a deal amongst politicians and so on. So it's within that spirit, that's what I mean with a shared commitment to growth and development. So to come soon now to the end of this is to actually recognize that this is more than just having a development plan. This is more than words. This is actually really seriously working on a deal for peace and stability in your country. This is really being self-aware, like in Bangladesh, the state can't do it, while in China, the state could do it. And maybe it did it like that in Vietnam. And even in Cambodia, they have to be a bit more careful when the state can't quite do it anymore. And similarly, there has to be something to do with, look, things can go wrong. There has to be accountability and learning. So you have these features that I have, is about serious about peace and stability, self-aware, and bureaucratic forms of where error correction is important. So I want to emphasize, these are not perfect institutions you start from. This is not a story anymore. Development has actually never been a story that first get your institutions right, and then you can start developing. You can do that you're doing with imperfection. That's the optimistic thing. Many of these places were very imperfect. Of course, they need to then work on these institutional improvements, but it's important that they do. This is also not about the market versus the state. It's more, use the state to the extent you can, but be conscious. And there I say, African countries, please be aware that your state capabilities and your history of the state is unlikely to be similar than a Chinese history of the state. So you may not be able to do as much as you may like from an ideological point of view. You have to be a pragmatic use of the state and the market, and not based on ideology. And in fact, we know from research, you can be a democracy and quite stagnant. Dare I say that Malawi is not growing very fast. Compared to Ghana, that has been growing quite fast with the democracy. It's not in itself enough. It's what you make of it that actually will always have to be important. But importantly, it's a gamble. It's a difficult one. I have a lot of respect for countries that don't manage to get this done, because it's really tricky. The domestic configuration, your initial conditions are difficult and as well. But it is a gamble, and for your elite as well, because status quo, if I have a lot of natural resources, status quo is quite safe for an elite, because then I don't really need to try to risk myself losing my position. In Indonesia, in the 1970s, they took a risk, even though they had natural resources, but they wanted to grow. And actually the elite became unstable, and there was all kinds of things happened. And in the Asia crisis, that elite actually lost power. So you actually have to be conscious and be respectful that it's hard. But I would love more countries to gamble on development. And what gives me hope is that actually more countries, including in Africa, have tried to do this in recent times. And that's for me a bit of the difference between these two countries, that at the time, when I was in DRC, they didn't really try. They couldn't quite get beyond their natural resource rentier under President Kabila, I think at the time. Maybe it's different now with the current prime minister, and the president, and I very much hope so. In Ethiopia, they tried, they gambled, but the politics somehow couldn't be kept together because it was a risk that they were taking too. So how do you then go towards it, and how can you help it? And I think this is where I will now briefly, in the last 3 minutes or so, talk about development finance. Because, how do you step towards it? Well, it can't be just words, it's about actions and behaviors. And in some places, it's going to be much harder to get the vested interest overcome and more difficult to reform. But you want to start seeing difficult things, politically difficult things, even for your own supporters. And you want to be generally seeking a elite coalition for stability, and of course, at least for peace, but definitely for stability. You don't want ideology to constrain what you do with the state versus the market. You want to be pragmatic. And you want to have systems of internal or external accountability. China doesn't have a democracy, but it could get checks and balances on its economic progress through internal accountability within the party. Democracy can be a force of that, but it's not necessary. But you need to have some accountability internally or externally to get it to work, because that's how you learn. So what can outsiders then do? And how can we get development finance in it? Well, it will be very straightforward, I think, to actually, and it's too simplistic, sorry, I should have said, it's too simplistic to make a distinction. There's gray areas of countries that what I call have a development bargain, a lead bargain for growth and development, and without a development bargain. But the minimal amount I want to say, if there's a development bargain, these are countries we should really support, and much more than we currently do in the current system. And in fact, we should do the things, and I know the African Development Bank does it, but for example, DFID and the FCDO does far less of it. When they really want development as a leadership and an elite that clearly is supportive of that, you do budget support, you work with government, you do anything you can, because then you really can support them to get there. And you want to be there early. You don't want to wait until they've been successful, but actually you want to be early there. But if they have no development bargain, where the elite bargain is stuck, and you have to be willing to accept it, you have to ask yourself, am I not just throwing good money after bad money? Am I actually doing something? Now, I'm willing to say we may be able to do good. We can maybe get some girls educated. We may well get some nutrition outcomes better and so on. But don't think that by offering finance, we buy reforms. It's never worked like that. Conditionality has never worked. Buying reforms doesn't happen. It's not like that. The evidence all suggests it. So you can't quite do it. You have to keep your eyes open widely. And, I'm happy to do good, okay? But that's not the same as helping to change a country. So the final thing is what you can do internationally or nationally. Internationally, and I can't say that much about it, but some really good things you can do is fighting illicit finance, because that's how very bad politics gets financed in Africa and all over the world. Tax havens, it's not about the loss of tax relief, it's about because they keep actually regimes imposed that shouldn't be imposed. Nationally, you need to always have an understanding that politics matters. I came back the last few days from meetings with senior advisors to presidents and prime ministers, the chief economic advisors of 25 African countries. You all the time end up talking politics, and they say their biggest problem is actually politics for me, because I can give good advice, but I know from political reasons it can't be done. And we had 2 days of intensively talking about how can we play that game of politics and the economy better. And you need to be able to do so. You can't be neutral as a technocrat. If you really want to reform, you need to understand the politics as well. So finally, what does it mean for development finance? So that's 3 things for me. The first thing, if we come for development finance, we should support very strongly and much more amply those countries that seem to be going to try something seriously, not just words, not just ideology, but seriously trying to get growth and development. And unfortunately, that is not how international development finance works. It works with quota systems that everybody gets the same thing. There is very little mechanism to really start supporting countries there. We have had a lot of African countries that really try to do something sensible, and they had to go to the capital markets to get extra finance. I'm not saying that every country that goes to the capital markets was going to do something sensible with it, but those who did, and I can name them, and I won't, well, there are some of the ones that I named, and actually I regret that there was not international finance. But at the same time, have no illusion that development finance in places without a serious elite commitment for development, I don't think we're going to have that much change. So We shan't simply say they need a lot of money, because money doesn't buy reforms. Money doesn't buy development. It's not the way it works. And I want finally to say, since in the introduction it was mentioned, when it comes to climate finance, I think we're risking making the same errors. There's countries that really want to make their energy transition and build resilience, and they don't get enough finance. While others, who have very little intention to make much of it, get quite a lot. So we want more finance, of course, in the developing world, but we also need to think carefully about where it goes. Of course, climate finance should also go to then directed to people who need to cope with the finance, but that's a form of doing good for development. But don't have any illusion that some of the investments then, they may not necessarily change these countries' trajectory. So I'm going to stop now, and I know I've overrun a little bit, but I hope you find it interesting. You can write to me. The book is available in various ways. It's accessibly written, I hope, for anyone there. And also, please, I'm not right on everything. So please criticize me, do it on social media, whatever. I totally respect that. And we can all keep on thinking, because we want the same thing, which is actually getting really growth in a lot more countries that brings down poverty at a large scale across the world. Thank you.
Professor Dakum, thank you.
Professor Stefan Dakum, thank you so much. That was quite insightful, illuminating, stimulating, and to an extent, inciting. Because I think there's so much meat you've dug out for that and shared with us, Professor Dakum. But let me just remind those who are watching and listening, if you want to take part in this discussion, you can do it on Twitter. Let me give you the hashtag, which is development finance models, hashtag development finance models. That's the Twitter hashtag. Please do follow this discussion. We also want your comments. You've been listening there to Professor Stefan Dakum, who has written his book about development finance and why he thinks it's a gamble. But Professor, when you say it's a gamble, by the same time, you did say that we've got to get institutions right. If you get the institutions right, why would it remain a gamble?
So I think of it where a lot of countries are at a particular moment. So when you start somehow, most societies at some moment, there's something we can define as the status quo. And there's something we can define, this is there. Change, including through growth, tends to change who is powerful and who is not. Some in the elite are often better at playing the growth game than others. And that's why it is a gamble. That's why I also think that from a political point of view, sometimes they don't want to take that gamble because they worry about it. Give me a very small example. In Indonesia in the early 1970s, the leader had come to power, this was Suharto, had come to power from a coup. He lacked legitimacy with the old elite, but he also recognized that he needed legitimacy with the population because the previous period had not developed much development. Actually, all elites were a bit worried about it, and he wanted to start doing development, but development actually was risking to unlock the existing elite as well. So he had to play a very careful game to actually, how do I stay in power while actually allowing a new part of the economy, which was export-oriented with Japanese investment and all the things, to evolve. How did he do that? He gave the old elite control of the nationalized industries, which included petrol, which are done to these days, Petromina, amongst the most corrupt holding companies in the country. He allowed, and this is a challenging thought, he allowed corruption still to be present amongst the old elite, because that was the only way he could actually start growing the economy. So I don't say I want to get the institutions right. A lot of people say you must do that first. Actually, now Indonesia, since then, has started to learn to reform and fight corruption better and better. So they could start with the growth, and then they begin now to tighten up all the work around corruption and so on. So it's not about getting the institutions right first. Actually, he started within imperfection. And I think that gives me hope that you can start within imperfection, but you have to really refocus. And then you can start attacking the vested interest a bit later. But you have to give space for them at first.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to get
Thank you so much, Professor Dakum. And I think I will have to leave my microphone on for that spontaneous reaction. I just wanted to get that one off my chest, first of all, and then I want to bring in here our Vice President and Chief Economist, Professor Kevin Orama. You've been listening there, Professor Orama, to your fellow professor here, talking about development financing and why it is a gamble. Just give me, first of all, your quick comments before I ask another question.
Thank you very much, Solomon, and thank you, Stefan, for that exciting presentation. Basically, listening to you, I hear a lot of things which really has been a bit befuddling in the way we push development and development models around the world. I hear you talking about imperfection is permissible, and yet we teach perfect markets. I hear you talking about development is a gamble, and yet we have rules-based development paradigms that we need to follow. And then ratings of how countries have followed those rules-based paradigms or not followed them, and that defines the cost of capital, transaction costs, and everything that we're talking about. I hear you talking about, yes, institutions are important, but it is not the panacea, for example. And yet we know that institutions shape transaction costs in the markets that we're having now. So there are so many things that we need to really chew as we go forward. And you also talk about heterogeneous paths. So it's not a single pathway, it's not a single governance system. There are so many things that we have put on the table that I hope that colleagues in the global community of practice will have to discuss for quite some time. When you talk about politics and political economy, how it matters and how we can use influence and ensure that we can be able to use that to, to move development forward. And more interestingly, you end with something that the African Development Bank Group has been calling for quite a lot, which is ramping up financing for development in the developing world, including in Africa. And you also talk about the misalignments of the current systems, the misalignments of global financial systems with the needs that is there and how to really get it work and so on. And the same with the climate finance. So I'm really looking forward to reading this book in more detail and engaging you in discussions as we have been for quite some time with yourself and your colleagues at the CSAE in Oxford University. But let me hand over to our moderator for the formal questions we need to address so that I can come back to addressing the major questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kevin. The question for you, Professor Kevin, is we're listening to what Professor has said here, and you've got also a number of things that you're trying to put on the table that are baffling, but do you think, if you take it back to what we started with about the global finance, development finance model, do you think it is fit for purpose?
Thank you very much again for that question. I hope I'm being heard by everyone. You know, when I hear that question, it just calls to mind the question that was asked of in the Bible, asked of Jesus Christ by the apostles of John the Baptist. Are you he who is to come, or should we look for another? And the way he responded is the way I'm going to respond to this question, because he said, go tell John what you see. The lame are seeing, the dead are being raised, all the miracles that he was doing. Say, just go see the evidence, and the evidence will tell the answer whether he was the person to come or not. So I just want to take us through a journey of evidence in Africa. First, Stefan mentioned it. Development financing needs in Africa are huge and growing by the day. But when we see the financial flows to Africa, I'm just running through this because in our AEO, we have already discussed this. To address only COVID-19, we need 432 billion US dollars between now and 2022, where we are now. To address climate change, which he mentioned, we need up to 1.6 trillion US dollars to address or to implement only the NDCs. But if you see the amounts that is coming into the continent, 18.3 billion US dollars annually, it's a far cry from what is needed. So if you think about the other financing needs that we have, infrastructure financing need, financing all the SDGs, I will just say, come and see whether the current global financing architecture is meeting the needs of development in Africa. And then he's giving us some of the trajectories that you can find internally within the continent. Or when you look at the globe, it's the same way that you find this heterogeneous influence of this financing architecture to all the other people. Financing flows to Africa is declining and has been for quite some time. If you actually map it on the world, that's those little dots on the lower part of that graph you see there. Declining from 1970 at 10% of the global to now about 4% of the global. So, and yet the financing needs are going higher. If you look at the graphs that Stefan showed in terms of poverty, poverty in Africa has not really gone down, as you have seen that it has happened in other continents. Share of trade, still very low as well. Those small black dots, and it's going down, it's not going up, while the global needs are increasing and the vulnerabilities is increasing. Access to research and development, still very low, almost at the x-axis. We have seen some of these graphs over and over. In terms of the issues of patents, which he talked about agency for development, you don't even see the points for Africa. Those black dots that are there in the x-axis of that graph. And when you look at all the things that development gives, Africa is lacking in them and has not been receiving enough of them. Whether it's Human Development Index, Africa's Human Development Index is not growing well. Per capita income is actually going negative in terms of per capita income growth in Africa. And you look at that graph, you can see that debt is rising after HIPIC, it's rising and rising. And if you look at all these indicators, the point here is just to say, come and see. When you look at the facts in Africa, the answer to that your question, whether the current global financing architecture is fit for purpose, is obvious.
That's quite depressing. You're on a very depressing run.
Okay, now let me come back to the run that you can see here. Then you find that global volatility is increasing, the risks are increasing, all these other things are increasing. There are obviously winners and losers, but this is on aggregate at the Africa level. If you look at disaggregate this, zooming into the continent, you find that several countries in Africa have been on the rise, as was shown by him. So my question then is, what do we do? There are winners and losers in this current global financing architecture, both in Africa and also around the world. So what is it that we need to do to ensure that we can leverage lessons and experiences from those who have been benefiting and be able to learn how to do it differently in our case? Now, the questions I will have for Stefan is when he talks about institutions, and you see all these things I've talked about, that is going down and down and down on the continent. How do we advise heads of states, ministers of finance in Africa to approach this gamble in the new global financing architecture that is being discussed everywhere? How do we bring together all these dialogues that's going on so that there is clarity in terms of how to be able to move forward? I do recall that this financial architecture was created in order to respond to some global crisis after the Second World War. We have major and overlapping crises that we're facing now. What opportunities are there for us to have a transformative change in how financial flows come into Africa, how the global finance architecture serves the continent, and how countries position themselves to have this gamble that you talked about and gamble in the right way? Because the thing with gambling is that you can lose big time and you can also gain big time. So how do we position Africa to gain big time in the new global financing architecture that we have? Because from where I sit, when I look at all the indicators at the aggregate level, Africa has not benefited that much from the current global financing architecture. The rating systems is not favoring the continent. The trade systems is not favoring the continent. Pricing of assets is not favoring the continent. The natural capital we have are grossly underpriced in the global markets. There are so many things that when you look at it, it looks as if you are going the pessimistic way, but actually these are facts that we need to keep in mind and see how we redesign or reform that architecture in order to be able to move forward. So back to how I started the answer, come and see.
Come and see. And already what you've just been displaying is out there for everybody to see. Let me bring in here former Senior Vice President here at the African Development Bank, Charles Bwama. You are listening to first whole presentation by Professor Dakum, and you've heard now Professor Ram as well. What's your take? You're joining us from the capital Accra.
Stimulating conversation so far, and thank you.
Charles, you're on mute.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you have to wear your... Oh.
Please use your headphone. Yes, we can hear you.
Listen to, okay.
Continue, Charles. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's a stimulating conversation. Just by way of his initial remarks, Professor, your comments, Professor Dakum, that is, your comments about imperfection. And I think, Mr. Moderator, you asked a question. I'd like to present it a different way. I think we should strive for perfection and yet be humble enough to understand that we are imperfect beings, right? And imperfect states and imperfect institutions. And therefore, all the ducks that do not necessarily have to be lined up before actions are taken. That might take Professor on what you said. But so far, stimulating conversations, and I think when we talk about it, we go back and forth between the global financial architecture, right, and then the development finance models, related but two different things. And my understanding is that the comments will focus a lot more on the development finance models, which I'll be speaking a bit more to as I respond to specific questions directed to me. So, Mr. Moderator, let me just stop there for now.
Right. Thank you so much, Charles, for your brief comments. And definitely, as I said earlier on, we've got quite a number of people who have joined us. They are sending their questions, they're making comments, and I'll be calling out on some of them. I want you to feel you're a part of this discussion. If you've got any question for Professor Dakum here, if you've got a question for Charles, if you've got a question for Professor Rama, please do get in touch. Let me just pick one here that is coming from Dr. Friday. I think if I may read Friday Ohuche. Friday is asking Professor, if development financing is a gamble, is development planning still necessary, especially in developing countries? That is Dr. Friday Ohuche asking that. If development financing is a gamble, is development planning still necessary in developing countries?
Look, so that's a good question, and I think I should to clearly explaining, when I use the metaphors of gambling, what I'm actually saying. So I've seen from an elite in a country, for those in power and influence, choosing to embark on the path of development is a gamble to the extent that growth and development usually untouches existing elites as well. So it actually has an impact. Where does the technocrat come into that is, of course, the planning part, and where I mean it as the technical advice, the technical issues that we give, is actually really important to try to be very clear to whoever has the power and influence society, is it the political leadership, the business leadership, that they're kind of aware what actually is going to come. You're planning, you give advice to actually help this. I wrote a piece for the Royal African Society in the UK the other day that I called In Praise of African Technocrats, and actually name some of these really amazing characters in the last few decades who were the ones that steered presidents and prime ministers sensibly into development. And many of you will know some of them. In fact, sometimes they are referred to in the academic literature as technopoles, technocratic politicians or political technocrats, who actually understand the politics and help to do that. And I think that's where technocrats come into it and good advice comes into it. So planning is important, but not in this sense of, I do this remotely away from the reality of the decision making, but actually I help my political leaders to have a vision translated into something sensible and having checks and monitoring and so on in there. So development planning is important, but not as a simple exercise as it sometimes exists. And in fact, I want to use this as a moment to actually answer also this point on what Charles actually correctly said, that the striving for perfection. I think, as technical advisories, we should, on the one hand, of course, try to make sure that the policies are really as good as possible. But we should understand where the weaknesses are from a political point of view with some of them. So where it may go wrong. So I think I want actually kind of more savvy people that actually don't simply give first best advice from our textbooks, but understands, if I want to pick between electricity reform or infrastructure financing and something else, that I'm actually smartly begin to deal with this. So we shouldn't be naive about it. So yes, we need actually technical people, very much so, but we need to be making sure that they understand the issues well. I want to, for a moment, actually clarify here another part where gambling is used in the discussion already, where the development finance could be a gamble. If we, as a development bank or as a donor agency, give money to a country, resources to a country, a loan or whatever, in some sense, it's of course a gamble as well, because you don't really know whether it will pay off as a project. But the really interesting thing is where, while I respect people in power and influencing countries to take the gamble, we, as financiers of development, should really be willing to gamble on those countries who are beginning to do it. They may not have a full track record of success, but actually we want to actually provide them and help them to de-risk it. And it allows me maybe to say a comment on what you said in terms of what would that new financial infrastructure potentially look like. So I think what is really important, I mean, I don't have a full plan, of course, but a few areas that it really is important is that I think the current system doesn't really have the right incentives for those who actually really tries to actually progress, to actually really get access to the finance, because it is a little bit too needs-based. And our view of who needs financing, rather than whether there actually is incentives for actually promoting the right things. And I think we should have a system, and I'm probably more ambitious even, that actually tries to that actually rewards countries that move towards more of a growth and development bargain, and actually doesn't necessarily finance in the same degree some other ones. But it's maybe that final part. We should see development finance actually as much as insurance than actually finance itself. Or put it differently, we should be the ones that de-risk those countries who actually try to really make progress with their own plans. And of course, we should give them advice and help the technocrats to correct the errors and the policies and so on. But we should have that kind of attitude. So it's there. And if I allow me, moderator, to actually pick up one point that Charles said about about the imperfection. So it's this other thing, you know, we should strive for imperfection, but we shouldn't start from the principle that there's only two worlds, the world that exists today, and then the perfect blueprint with the perfect institutions. It just doesn't work like that. We just need to be willing to say, not necessarily condone the imperfection. We should strive for first best. We shouldn't condone, we shouldn't cherish the imperfection, but we may sometimes understand that certain things may in the beginning to be really hard. So I've never said, and nobody should ever quote me as if I've said that corruption is a good idea. No, I understand sometimes how it exists and what it actually is doing, but I want to get rid of it. And I want to actually us working all the time to actually towards it. But it's this more realistic sense of, you know, where can we go next with our institutions rather than this kind of push for the first best institutions from day one, which gives then advice that is so far removed from reality that actually what we then get in the end sometimes is even worse than what we had before. And so we want to be much more understand where a country is and where is it going. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I know there are quite a number of questions around the global finance model.
There are quite a number of questions around the global finance model, but Chris Chalmers, I just wonder, you're putting on your hat, you could choose whichever one as an executive director at the African Development Bank representing Italy, Netherlands, the United Kingdom, or your hat when you were working for the UK's International Development Department, DFID. And when you listen to what Professor is saying, development is a gamble, what needs to be done? What's your take, briefly?
I think that actually it's a really positive message. So I think the first thing I'd say is that the message is that it doesn't matter so much the current status quo that a country is in. It isn't that some countries have some sort of inherent ability to develop and others don't have this inherent ability. It's more about every country has people in it that have agency. Countries themselves have agency. And the question is whether those individuals who have the agency and what they choose to do with that agency, how they use the agency, the power, if you like, that they've got. And if they choose to do it collectively, one of the ways to do that collectively is through an institution. So I actually take it to be a very positive message that every country has a chance of finding a way towards development. It doesn't matter if it has a strong state traditionally, it doesn't matter if it has a weak state traditionally. But what we do need is a sort of somebody who's brave enough to take the step. The problem is that people have got to a position of agency through the existing system that a country may have. And therefore, if they are taking a step that will bring the country forward, or even just themselves forward, that is taking a risk. It's the gamble, because you're moving beyond the system that has put you where you are in the first place. So it is a gamble, but what we need to do, and I suppose as institutions, whether I have my AFDB hat on or my sort of past hat as working for the UK, the question is, how do we help to provide some incentive, either whether it's a push to those people with agency or whether it's a pull to them to take that step, to be brave, to take the gamble.
Is this something we're just discovering now, or is something we should have really been doing for many, many years?
You're asking me. I think you will find, as indeed Stefan's presentation shows, that there are many examples of where this has been done brilliantly successfully in the past. There's nothing inherently wrong about, so the current system doesn't mean we can't do this. It's just that in many cases we don't have that savvy, sort of deep enough and practical enough understanding of the internal political dynamic within a country. It doesn't, not about Africa, just in general. So it can be done, has been done in the past, but it isn't done everywhere. You need to find ways of doing it more in more places, I guess.
I just want to actually emphasize, development finance played a big role in places like Bangladesh, or in places like Ghana. When used well, we can really do quite amazing things with it. So it's not as if we're rediscovering something that we're discovering something totally new. It is actually, we just haven't found ways of applying it enough in lots of different settings to find actually that way of working within countries and translating some of the successes. And I'm optimistic there's more countries where this will now be possible in the future.
Thank you so much. Let me come to you, Charles. Charles, you were brief. You made some brief comments there, but I think they also stirred good reactions from Professor Dakum here. Let me just go back to the issue around global financial models, because talking about financial, foreign direct investment, talking about global trade, green climate financing, pricing of whether it's raw materials from Africa, you've got to see how that really equates or fits into the global financing models. And the question here is, so what are the effects of the global financial models on costs, risks, vulnerability, and flaws of development finance, and this could be domestic and external, in Africa?
No, thank you. That's quite a loaded question. Let me start again by maybe making a comment on a comment that Professor you made, Professor Dakum, on the rewarding sort of the good students and providing the right incentives, and that is fine. But and that's going to lead me to my response to your question, Mr. Moderator. But the risk there is that you can end up with this inordinate amount of attention and focus on essentially these external support as the main driver of your development, which is, if you look at, I think, the examples you gave the Indonesians, and really some of the things they've done right is to, and I'll fall back on, I don't have any slides to show, but at the last Global Community of Practice, I think one of the previous sessions that I participated in, I offered sort of a quadrant approach to look at the financing model. And the, just one second, as I speak, yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, my thing is, let me just make sure perfect. Yeah, listen, I'm good now. It looks like I was run out of juice on my so I make sure I'm plugged in.
You're plugged in properly.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now, the point I'm making is that in this, I want to build on what we discussed at one of the earlier sessions, which is when you look at the financing framework, right, of any country, you would have the domestic sources and the external sources. And then within each source, you have debt sources of financing and then the non-debt sources of financing. Oftentimes there's so much attention on certain things that, yes, are needed now to, shall we say, you have a crisis. So whether it's, debt restructuring, whether it's the, even the current conversations on the SDR allocations, etc. These are important steps. I'm not saying they are not, but we must put them in the broader context and say, what aspect of the global financing picture do they address? And in the long term, what are some of the areas we should be paying more attention to? I'd submit that the areas that we should be paying a lot more attention to are the domestic non-debt aspects of the financing framework. And I think, Professor, you gave one example when you talked about IFF, illicit financial flows. That goes too very much to the heart of boosting your domestic non-debt financing sources. And so to respond to your question in terms of the vulnerability, the cost, it depends. It depends on what? It depends on the extent of reliance on the financing sources. I would argue that if you are substantially dependent on domestic non-debt sources of financing, the vulnerabilities are lower. They still exist, but they are lower. The costs are lower. And conversely, if you are dependent more on external, let's say, debt sources, and that's where you talk about rating agencies, the actions, all these different things, they affect all of those. The vulnerabilities are much higher. Just last week, the World Bank released the report on the Global Economic Prospects report. And they make statements to the effect of essentially most sub-Saharan African countries being having a heightened financial vulnerability. For me, that's just fancy talk for essentially being substantially dependent on these kinds of sources that when you have a crisis, whether it's a global financial crisis, not be talking about the risk of stagflation and all of that, that these sources get hit and get hit hard. Whether it's because you are essentially at the mercy of other people's generosity, and when they have to tighten their own belts and do certain things, you are severely hit, or you are so heavily dependent on some, the capital markets where access may be constrained, et cetera, and so forth, you definitely will be hit a lot harder. So simple response, the vulnerabilities really depend on the mix of your financing sources. And I would argue that the challenge and the big push for me would be for countries to essentially be looking a lot more seriously, spending a lot more time on the domestic non-debt sources of financing, right? Which in the long term is what would make them more resilient. So let me stop there for now. I know there's probably a lot packed in there that we can unpack if time allows.
You're right, Charles, about that. There's a lot, and I can see quite a lot of questions are flying in, and I think it's important we bring in these questions as well. Professor, when you respond, make it a bit brief because we want to pack in as many questions as possible. People are really enthused by this debate. Yannick is saying, how can easily manage the exploitation of natural resources in case where it belongs to government, and we know administrative slowness and sometimes conflict. Administrative slowness and sometimes conflict, that's what Yannick is pointing out. We've got Sonia Beng, who is saying, thanking you for a very interesting presentation, and this discussion is interesting, saying the challenges are multiple. Should we not be more specific by regions and countries? Some regions face currency harmonization issues. And then how can we help them with the local currency financing? Something around suppliers when they borrow in US dollars or repay in US dollars or foreign currencies. But how do we help them with the local currency financing? So those are two questions for you quickly. And let me just say, if you've got a question in French, please do ask it because we've got translation, we've got interpreters who are going to do that job for us. Don't hesitate. But Professor, those two questions.
Look, very briefly, just answering. So the first one, it mentions natural resources, and I know the question goes in a particular direction, and of course these are often important issues. One of the things that we have to just recognize that a country that has a lot of natural resources, for those people with power and influence, the status quo is very attractive. It's a very easy way to keep the status quo because your resources come in, and we should just be conscious that change is often much harder, and gambling on development has actually, the status quo is pretty good. And so it provides another way of thinking on the kind of the political economy explanation of why is it so hard for these countries sometimes to choose diversification, and currency issues come into it. It's very attractive then to keep your exchange rate overvalued. It's, because that actually serves those who are currently in power and have access to to enough wealth to have cheap imports and so on. So we know these issues, and I'm just conscious, and it links to the second question. Do we have to be much more specific about countries and regions? You know, the one thing I think that is at times upsetting, I think it upsets me and it upsets many of my friends from Africa, is that there is this push to success is defined like what China did, this kind of growth rate, or the growth rates of Korea. You know, they are so exceptional and they're so specific. Every country will have its own challenges and historical issues to do with colonialism, historical issues to do with natural resource dependence. They will make it harder to get really, really high growth. This is why I like also emphasizing in Bangladesh, which is a pretty messy place. So when people say, look, it should be more specific about regions, about countries, but we can see within them, you know, that we have examples in West Africa, in East Africa, that actually have started to do better. And actually, you know, just look for your peer groups and don't expect it to start looking much too far. And I do think most countries will have examples of countries with quite similar conditions that actually end up doing a bit better. And I think it's in that spirit I would just answer it, you know. Yes, we need to be specific and every country has its peculiarities, but we'll be willing to learn from imperfection again. Other countries that may not be perfect, but again, progress and doing a bit better than you.
I'll pick one more question from our audience.
Solomon, on that.
Let me pick here a question from a member of the audience. They are really engaged with this topic. Shimelis Fekadu says, dear professor, certainly elite bargain is important for meaningful and sustained progress. The challenge is the traditional context of elite. They've managed to change and they're changing. A new claim of being elite emerges endlessly because of easy visibility created by social media. This creates endless list of elite group in quotes or interest groups. And these groups, Fikedu says, however weak they are, but good enough to disinform and disorient the population. And that puts brakes on the government and on the process of institution building. What do you think?
No, this is an excellent observation. And it's really, and I really applaud the observation because, you know, basically within any country, I mean, I'm actually having worked now very closely with politicians in the UK and having now worked over the last 30 years in so many ministers of finance and so on. I can only have admirations actually at some point for politicians who actually manage to bring change, because it's an incredibly hard job, because one of their big parts is exactly what Shimeles is alluding to, which is somehow leaders, they're not leaders on their own. They need to actually bring very powerful interests together. And they need to find a common narrative, a current story that they need to be able to tell. And they need to actually then not just be words, but actually put it into practice. So the fact that we see progress gives me hope that these things are possible. But these are Shimeles just describes how hard it at times can be. And of course, if we have ways of helping, you know, I see from the name that I probably suspect that he may well be from Ethiopia, is that, you know, 10 years ago, I remember we actually had requests, a bit less than 7 years ago, requests from the Prime Minister to say, can you help us how we actually get social media to actually be less extreme in its racial hatred and the nationalities hatred. We know what happened in Ethiopia. You know, these things are really key. And these are the challenges of leadership that you have. But that still gives me hope that there are still politicians and members of the public intellectuals, members in civil society that actually find ways of doing it. So as I said, they appealed to it 6-7 years ago, that actually social media was already getting full of hatred around the different nationalities. At the time, kids were on the streets. We didn't have war. We didn't have now the total destabilization. Probably what I make the link here is that, you know, we saw this coming because the country was increasingly destabilized in populist hatred amongst the different groups as well. And if we know one thing about conflict, it's often leaders being very good at exploiting salient pressures and tendencies. So it's one of these things that finding a way of a coalition of stability, for example, I would say that's the next step for Ethiopia. Can we actually refine stability in that society as the first step to go back to development?
I'll be going in for more comments, but let me just first of all go to the issue of multilateral development finance institutions and their role in shaping and redesigning global development finance. And this is a question for you, Charles. I may bring in Professor Urama as well. But Charles, what are the roles of multilateral development finance institutions like the African Development Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development in reshaping and redesigning global development finance models to make them proper and more inclusive to achieve sustainable development goals, because time is ticking away?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Solomon. Am I? Yes, I'm on.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Again, I'll just build on some of my earlier comments with regard to the model to start with. And it's one of the most important things I think the MFIs should be doing, and I think many are doing that to some extent, would be to all the types of support, right, that will move the countries more towards the resource flows, right, that are of a more resilient nature. And this is where I talk about the sort of the domestic non-debt type of resource flows. The question that was asked earlier about natural resource management and getting the most, it's an aspect of this resource flow, okay? And the more you can, you take, I think, Professor, you gave the example of Indonesia in terms of the stellar performance and if you go and read Indonesia's story, at least a little I know, there was a lot of focus on that aspect of their financing framework, right? So, and there, the fact remains that you would have, there'll be a lot of some geopolitical dynamics as well at play in terms of when you start to talk about value addition and bring in essentially those types of activities into your country so that you're not just a primary commodity exporter. As the professor I think alluded to, the status quo is easier to maintain. And there are a lot of very strong vested interest to maintain the status quo. Now, there needs to be an honest conversation about really honest efforts to change that status quo for the benefit of developing countries. So that's one whole big set of conversations that I think I know should take place to change the picture.
But Charles, before you continue,
yes.
continue, just one point
Yes.
you've made, Charles, that I still not so clear is around what you alluded to as domestic non-debt aspects of how you deal with these things. And you rightly put your finger on illicit financial flows. How do you deal with illicit financial flows without, first of all, understanding why they exist in the first place? And the person who's going to deal with that is the person still in charge of it.
Right. Now, just to expand that a bit, when we talk about the domestic non-debt, yes, the usual, your reform your tax systems, etc., fees, royalties. You have your improved management of natural resources, which is, we just touched on that. Stemming illicit financial flows. Digitization, which provides a certain foundation for improved tax collection and other things. So there are a whole host of measures. And I'm not saying that these are brand new. There's a whole bunch of things that certain countries are already doing. And certain multilateral development institutions are indeed supporting some of these efforts. What I'm saying that there should be a whole lot more of that. Specific to your question on illicit financial flows, we've all seen the reports, the billions that are lost every year. And I think I would just build on a comment that the professor made, that there are clearly strong vested interests in the status quo, right? And so if the change is not easy, it's because the current system has a lot of benefits to certain groups and certain, even companies. And they actually will also have some rent seeking internally, domestically, in the countries where these flows are moving out of. And so these are very tough political, it's a political problem, let me put it that way, with serious economic consequences. But that doesn't mean that it should not be addressed. That doesn't mean that it should not be attacked. And I believe there are increasingly more tools, right, to shine light into some of these dark areas. And that is the only way that you're going to essentially break this what has been seemingly intractable issue over the last many years. There's a lot of other very detailed work going on this, but again, I just, for the purpose of this conversation and noting the time, want to make these broad remarks, and certainly will be happy to engage anybody that wishes to go into a lot more detail on this. So thank you. Yeah.
And Charles, I'll come to you, Professor, but I just wanted to say that Charles mentioned the idea of digitization, and actually you've got Joy Zens, and Joy, your question has now been answered actually, because what Charles said is in response to the question you're posing, where you're saying, do you think digitization is the way to Africa, to have Africa in the picture? Communication and involvement in discussion like this one is only through digital. Shouldn't we be investing more in digitization? But of course, there Charles was talking about digitization as one of the ways where, in terms of managing taxation, and how you do revenue collection, you could make those kind of systems digital to avoid people handling money directly and then that money being diverted. Professor Rama, you wanted to come in there, just building on the role of multilateral development institutions in tackling some of these things we are discussing.
Yeah, thank you. Again. So thank you very much, moderator. And I think my senior brother, Charles, has really touched on most of the major issues. I just need to add a few things about, the risk premium that African countries pay for accessing, capital markets, and also the financing that they receive because of what I'll call the risk perception premium. Not just the risk itself, in terms of how the risk is perceived and so on. Helping, though the keynote speaker talks about institutions, but building institutional capacity for governance to create greater transparency, to reduce that risk perception in terms of both financial risk, political risk, market risks, are crucial, because that reduces the cost of capital inflows and also improves the use of the domestic revenue that Charles has rightly homed in on. But another thing that already the African Development Bank is doing in terms of trying to help address the currency risk, which is a major challenge also for African countries, because you notice even debt increases for not borrowing more, but just because the dollar is appreciating. So and your debt is increasing, you haven't borrowed more. So helping to also to do local currency denominated debt will be very useful for many African countries or many developing countries. So at least to cut that, the forex risk that is there. But one other point that I want to put on the table for a discussion.
To jump in here, the issue about the use of local currency or local currency when it comes to borrowing. How feasible is that? Which donor would want to give you development aid in Zambian kwacha or whatever shillings? Who will do that?
I wish that our acting Vice President of Finance, Hassatu Nsele, is here, and she will tell you that the innovativeness of the African Bank Group, they're already doing this.
The volume can't hear.
Charles,
open your microphone, sir.
Sorry. I was on mute. So I'm saying that, the African Development Bank Group is already doing that. And if our Vice President Hassatu Nsele is here, for finance, she would tell you that that's already been done. And Charles is nodding there because he was a senior vice president. He was VP finance and then senior vice president when all these innovations were being introduced. So my call is that more of that needs to be done to help to actually solve this problem. But the very pertinent thing I want to raise, and Professor Stefan, we started with this chatting when you came in before the session, is dealing with what I'll call the paradox of growth. Many African countries, when they graduate from being low-income countries to middle-income countries, and because they're doing what you were saying in terms of doing the right things to grow their economies, they then appear to be punished in terms of accessing finance because the concessional financing goes down and they're forced to go to high cost open markets to get the resources for their financing. How would you expect that to be dealt with? I'm a panelist and I'm asking questions because these are very important things. So it's a very something I would like to get your views about and Charles's views, and also from the audience in terms of how to address that, but also for MDBs to harness a lot of what I'll call the trust capital. The African Development Bank Group is very highly trusted by African governments and African countries, and that is a very big capital that needs to be harnessed in terms of helping countries with reforms, with institutional capacity, with also taking this gamble that we've been talking about. E.D. Chalmers sitting here, so that the board of the African Development Bank, assisting countries to be able to take some of these gambles is useful. Learning from examples of other countries that have done it in Africa successfully, and also those that have done it outside of Africa successfully. That will also be very, very helpful in moving things forward.
I only want Professor to answer your question, and one of the questions or the points you've just made, Professor Rama, there is actually a gentleman called Edwin Wichaponda who has raised an interesting point about capacity building, where he says in the same government on matters to do with climate change, you'll find people in the ministries of environment that deal with matters to do with climate, they receive capacity building, but those in the treasury don't, and they're the ones who release funds. And therefore you find two ministries where one is aware and knows what needs to be done, but the other one is not aware, does not have that capacity to understand these things. And they're the most important because they hold the purse strings. Professor.
Yes.
I will answer and come to your question as well, and then pick up my colleagues. Professor here also has a question as well, and it reminds me on the, because the broader question is of course, how do multilateral development banks and so on then actually respond? What do they do? And so I really liked what Charles was mentioning around, we should be calling out when those who block the status quo and so on. Now, it's incredibly difficult to do that for kind of an outside agency, especially a multilateral agency, to actually do this. And so, but there is something fundamentally not going right if we only at night, when we're sitting in the bar, talking about the politics and all the things we have, and during the day we behave as if politics doesn't exist, as if the vested interest doesn't exist and so on. And it creates a bit of a kind of schizophrenia that I have a lot, and I have to definitely also as well working in the system in the UK, like during the day you're the technocrat, and at night you actually really let it all out and you talk about it. So there must be something there, alluding to also what Charles is suggesting and recognizing the problems, that when you work as a technocratic organization, that actually has to be politically neutral. How do you find a way to actually giving much more politically informed advice? And it's just informed, and that's the important part, with a much deeper understanding of what are the dynamics going on in each particular place. And actually thinking about, look, I will not name the country, but there's like one particular country which I think since forever almost has really been terrible in the way it operates in its agricultural markets. And actually it has the highest seasonal variation in highest seasonally unpredictable variation in prices of any African country. And I know for a fact it's because one institution is politically controlled, and it's a great source both of procurement fraud and for other things. And it's so close to the leading parties that it will not be reformed. Maybe, and I'm not naming them apparently, because I promised not to get anyone in trouble. But if you read my book, you will see the name of the country popping out. But it is important that I would actually say, look, if we ever want to have an agricultural program in that country, that clearly should be changed, because otherwise the return to that program will always be low, because actually a basic principle of a market can't work. And I mean by that, it is understanding somehow when you would do certain programs or not, so understanding it. And it links back to the capacity building question that they raised then. You know, it's not just about having someone who can actually make a compliance with different plans in the ministry. Of course you want it, but actually the best thing that the Multilateral Development Bank can do is to make sure that in the right places, the right people also have the right insights and actually help them to maneuver the difficulties of their own systems. So, you know, many of the people, senior people definitely in the ADB, actually know that game very well. They will have played it sometimes in their own countries. They have been part of that thing as well, and they know how to maneuver it. And it's making sure that we get capacity everywhere of smart technocrats that actually can still do the best they can within systems without feeling like, oh, well, in my country, that gets all stuck in there. So if we go to capacity building, please not just thinking we're going to get another course that someone can comply with another rule that actually is not applied, but actually that you think very smartly, where will I need the technocrats, as Charles was alluding to in Indonesia, they had them at some point, that actually are in the key places, in the key organizations that actually can change it. In Indonesia, I could name them and I'm not, but the players were remarkable in maneuvering the president during the 1980s towards much more market-oriented policies for the benefit of the population. And, you know, these people are well known and some became very senior in the World Bank later on. But they were smart in maneuvering that space, and they get them brought back in their own governments later on. So it's that kind of thing that we should have a bit for that. So I'll leave the capacity building point there, because we need to be more creative about what we mean by what is the capacity we need. We need better people to maneuver these spaces to get actually progress.
Yeah, I know time is running out.
Solomon,
It is getting exciting. So many comments. What I want the panelists to do is to begin to think about key takeaways from this discussion. And while you're thinking about that, I will burden you, Professor, with a question from Blessing Beru, who says, how do we deal with the overriding political influence and control that trumps every economic analysis and models? Africa's politics is substantially influenced by local and international rent-seeking interests and divorced from development and addressing the challenges facing the citizens. That is the elephant in the room. So you want to kill the elephant, or want to pluck out the tusks?
Shall I go for that?
Go for that.
Yeah.
Oh, the elephant killing.
I'm so glad that someone mentions the elephant, because my book is full of other animal metaphors.
Yes.
I don't have an elephant, but I have tigers, leopards, hippos, and hyenas.
Yeah.
And I have tigerfish.
And I hope you're riding the tiger.
Well, the tiger is there. The tiger is a scary animal. The leopard is definitely a scary animal.
Yeah.
And so on. Yeah. So, you know, but this is not the elephant.
Your microphone, sir.
It's actually the animals that I actually want to bring out and actually not simply ignore, but actually talk about. So yes, Blessing, this is exactly the right question. But the experience again shows that actually countries begin to overcome these things, and that there are places where we manage to get them overcome, or where, for example, you know, one of the things of how good development and growth policies start coinciding with political influence.
Sorry, excuse me, Professor Dakum. Professor Dakum, can you please unmute your microphone?
that is the way you should interpret what happened in 20th century history in Europe, is that actually increasingly the concerns about what happened.
Sir, your microphone, please.
Employment became more important. And that actually is something we will start seeing. And I'm not going to play off one country against the other, but there's at least a number of countries in Africa where it's essentially part of the legitimacy of the government.
Hello, Solomon. Solomon, can you ask Professor Dakum to unmute, please?
I was not very clear, and
okay.
Hopefully people could just about use it. Microphone was somehow covered here, but I hope you online people got most of that. But it is somehow the important takeaway is that it is possible gradually, and there are ways of doing it. I talk a lot in the book about some of the things that could be supported. I don't think that is the kind of things that the development bank could do. But it's actually that point going back to it is that, you know, supporting those technocrats, or even maybe even in politics, and working with them who actually generally want growth and development. And that actually you strengthen their position, and by offering the right tools. I will say again, in Indonesia, that was very much part of the way that the change started happening, is that the technocrats gave the politicians more support in using growth and development as a way of justifying the political position. And so it's this smart way of working with them actually will get it. But yes, the world is difficult. And I think Kevin earlier was giving us all the reasons why we should worry about it. But it leaves me still with optimism, because the world has always been difficult. You know, some of these countries were successful in the middle of Cold War. They were successful in the middle of the 1980s crisis that hit Africa so badly. Then Bangladesh started to take advantage then, and so on. So they, you know, don't simply be too depressed. Change is happening. I don't know where it will be first, but actually there are definitely places that give me a lot of hope, including in Africa.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor. And as I said and prompted all our panelists, we were reaching that point where we now want to just crystallize things, consolidate this discussion, and come up with some key takeaways. And I'll start with Charles Bwama in Accra, Ghana, former Senior Vice President here at the African Development Bank Group. Charles, what's your key takeaway? Hello, Charles.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Apologies for that.
Thank you. Okay.
Very quickly, lots of takeaways, but let me, for me, two things that I will highlight. One is, and I think, Kevin, you probably touched on that, many of the things that need to be done can only happen when there is trust in the system. And trust in the system, and this is something I think I spoke to in another conversation, between the government, the private sector, and civil society. And because when Professor talked about some of the politically difficult things to do, necessary things to do, but politically difficult to do, these things can be done and should be done, but what makes it, what is an otherwise impossible, maybe a very difficult task, possible, is a certain trust that exists in the system. And for me, a key takeaway is, as we look at, reforming the models and moving to different models, there needs to be a lot of effort and work by governments on essentially addressing all the elements that enhance trust between the key actors, private sector, government, and civil society. So that's one message that I'll leave with this conversation. The second broad message, again, going back to that, if you picture this quadrant that I drew, that you have domestic debt sources, domestic non-debt sources, external debt and external non-debt sources, that the actions of multilateral finance institutions, of the countries themselves, should be deliberately geared towards moving their dependence more on the domestic non-debt sources of financing. And I think when you put yourself on that trajectory of just moving deliberately in that direction, you'll be over time less vulnerable, you'll be more resilient. And that would be my message. Is it easy? No, but it absolutely has to be done, and there needs to be a very deliberate focus on moving there. One general point, which is not a takeaway, is of course the conversations are focused necessarily on the financing models and financing sources. This is not to say that on all the other things that essentially are necessary for efficient, effective development to happen, efficient public financial management, or all these other things, that's even on the expenditure side. We didn't talk about those much, but I just wanted to mention them in passing that, of course, the focus of deliberate is not to say that those things are not important. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I know you're pressed for time. You may actually be leaving us shortly, but if you can hang on until the end, we are actually just wrapping things up. And of course, we'll end with the host. So we'll go to Professor first of all, because the host will tell us what you really make of this discussion and where Africa is headed after listening to Professor once again. Professor, since you made your initial presentation, there have been reactions. Are there things you feel that you really need to clarify on, some key points that we really need to take away from this discussion?
I think the comments that were given very much reflect how I also think about some of the challenges with some of the things I said. And apologies for those online that my microphone was briefly not working well earlier. But it's that general point that there are everywhere in the world interest groups, locally, internationally, that are not making it easy for us. And maneuvering this space is really, really important. As it comes for how we act, and that's maybe the final point I want to make, is that it's when you think of an organization like the African Development Bank or others. Of course, you can't tell your shareholders that the only thing you end up doing is gambling. But I actually would say at the moment, we are gambling against better wisdom. We are gambling and giving a lot of development finance to places where there's very little reason to believe that at this moment, there is an environment that will provide us with a reasonable return. Now, so it's not about us becoming more gamblers now, but it's actually becoming a bit like Warren Buffett. In fact, in the book, I talk about an investment model like Warren Buffett, the richest equity investor in the world. And basically his point is that, you first of all gamble for the long term. You gamble because you really see an upside. So that actually, you don't gamble in places where there's no sign of an upside. But you actually gamble also on a team, on your partner. And I think that's so important, is that within your portfolio, you should be willing to gamble for the longer term. And that includes countries that actually then begin to progress, but you don't want to leave them behind. You don't want to go away from them. You said, I'm going to see the course. And what you don't want to give them is a cliff, where for a while you support them and say, oh, now you have to stand to your own legs, even though the progress is still risky, to give an answer to that. So we should think of our development finance as a portfolio of both investments that increasingly become safer because there's progress, and investments where it's still a gamble. And of course, I want us to gamble on any place where there's a bit of hope, little bit of peace, even a very bad place where say, look, maybe in this sector, there are a few operators here that actually generally want to try something. Shall we support them, strengthen them? And so you get a kind of a portfolio of lots of smaller bets that are highly risky, some kind of medium bets where you're getting better, where you think there's a real development bargain emerging. And then you actually keep on supporting quite safe bets, those who actually progressed with you. And so you have that, but always with the longer term, in a partnership, investing in the team as well, not telling them what to do because they have to own their development, and then see what the progress, what it gives us for the portfolio in the end. Thank
Thank you so much for that, Professor. Let me come to Chris Chalmers, Executive Director, representing Italy, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and of course, you work with the United Kingdom's International Development Department. David, you've heard it all. You must be having some key.
We cannot hear you, sir. Sorry.
And so we're going to approach development finance in places like Africa.
Sir, please, we cannot hear you.
Yes, thanks, Solomon. There's 2 points I wanted to finish off with actually on my side. Firstly, on development finance, I think we've talked a bit about the African risk premium, the African risk perception. And I think quite strongly that many of our institutions, the AFDB certainly, but also bilateral development finance institutions often talk about this risk premium being incorrect, being a misjudgment of the market. And I really do think there is a bigger place for risk sharing mechanisms and a bigger place for guarantee instruments that our institutions can look at. Particularly if we ourselves don't believe the risk is there, there should be no problem whatsoever in us helping to take on some of that risk ourselves. So I think for development finance institutions, that is a financial instrument that is underutilized, and we should be looking at it more. And then the other point that picked up actually from the beginning of the talk when Stefan talked about accountability as a feedback mechanism. And we could indeed see it the other way around, feedback as an accountability mechanism. And I really think that many governments have, and if they don't have, they should have, the humble evaluation function. And I do think there is a role perhaps for our institutions as development finances just to perhaps give a bit of support to evaluation. We can often underrate it as a sort of, it's the sort of the softest and the least scary of any sort of accountability mechanism is the evaluation team. But somehow I think it can have a bigger role to play than we often think. So I would perhaps urge that we think again and try to see what we can do in the different partner countries on that area.
But also I think, Chris, about helping the governments to understand the purpose of the evaluation system and how it is useful to them and how they can own the narrative for what will come out of it.
It's about looking at ourselves and learning lessons.
Yes, yeah. That's right. Professor Rama, I can see you still in a pensive mood. I think you had quite a number of questions you were having at Professor Dakum, and so many things have come up, but I'm sure you've got some takeaways you gleaned out you want to leave us with.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. And I would like to thank Stefan for coming on a very short notice, and Charles for joining us also on a very short notice, and my ED, the Chalmers, also for doing the same, and yourself as a moderator. And as always, the global community of practice stakeholders, we are here because of you. Thank you for all the wealth of knowledge and information you've shared with us. As usual, we're going to glean all these things and try to synthesize them into a short policy document that we will share with you for inputs and make available to our member countries. In terms of takeaways, both Charles, Chris, and Stefan have actually picked on the 6 key points that I wanted to go home with on this. Enhancing the trust capital, focusing on internal revenue mobilization in terms of what we need to do internally as countries to position ourselves to benefit better from the current system, enhancing the institutions and public financial management systems to plug the holes and reduce illicit financial flows, and also the risk guarantee, dealing with the risk premium issue, and basically also looking at how the risks are done in terms of the models for risk evaluation for countries, risk ratings, and so on, and then feedback as accountability system. So these are very key points. Let me just end with 2 more, which is one that is colored all around all the metaphors in Stefan's paper, book, which is that context matters. So we need to deal with countries on country by country basis, recognizing that the political economy is different, the culture is different, where they are in development is different, and the rule of the game or the non-rule of the game for the gambling is also different. So this is something I also go home with from all this discussion. And then the final thing is more for the general, global financing architecture in itself. We see from all these discussions, there are a series of discussions happening everywhere regarding the subject. And for me, one of the key things that this discussion can help us to do is to try and start narrowing down to bring some kind of consensus building, coordination, so that we begin to see where things are going. And I'm taking that from what Stefan just said in his closing remarks. Every types of crisis is always huge opportunities for innovation. And within every crisis, as Einstein says, lies the opportunities for some form of innovation and so on. And looking at the system now, I see increasing fragilities in the global financial markets. I see high levels of volatility that has been caused by geopolitical tensions, increasing fragmentation, polarization, or even some people call it bifurcation in the global financial markets. And these are begging serious questions, just like it did after the Second World War. You talked about countries that benefited during the crisis, the Cold War, the financial crisis. That's always the case, that during these kinds of challenges, the human ingenuity is to innovate and come out on a better side of it, learning from it. So my hope is that this crisis we are facing will also not be left to waste, that we do have a Roosevelt that has the political will to come up with a New Deal. And we also have smart economists and smart sociologists, political economists, and so on, that will also come up with new models like we had from all our fathers in economics that try to shape this new model. So for me, I stop on that positive note that there are opportunities for innovation here, and we're living in a decade that will actually shape history. And I'm very happy to be part of it, and I'm sure you are too. Let's keep working together on this, and we see where it leads us. And hopefully we'll come up with something that is more inclusive, gender inclusive, pro-poor, includes the youth and creates opportunities, and is not as misaligned as we see now. Finally, on climate finance, the conclusion where Stefan started, we need more concessional financing for Africa to support the domestic revenue mobilization that Charles has also called for. Because from where the continent is now, based on the figures I showed you, there is a lot of help that we all need. And this is a sustainability imperative for the global financing system in itself, because the fragilities it has created has made itself fragile. So the source of fragility is becoming fragile. So we really need to try and build that trust by mobilizing more concessional financing for Africa. Because when you look at all the systems now, there's a misalignment in the structure, in the scale, and in the flow of financing to the places where you need them. Whether you think of development financing, ODA flows and for addressing poverty, or FDIs, portfolio investments, or even climate finance, is totally misaligned with those where it's really going to make a lot of impact. And I'll stop there, thanking all of you again for being here. And this is just as usual, every GCOP session is a start of a discussion. So let's continue with that discussion, and thank you so much.
You're right, Professor Rama. The discussion continues on hashtag development finance models on Twitter. Please do visit there, because this is not just an event that started and ended. The conversations are beginning, and of course, we now know that it's never about just what do we do. It is why are we not doing what we've always known needs to be done. Thank you so much, Professor Rama. He's the Vice President and Chief Economist at the African Development Bank Group. Earlier on, you heard from Chris Chalmers, Executive Director. He's in charge of Italy, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands here at the bank. We had Charles Bwama, who may have left by now. Charles, a globally respected executive with many years of leadership experiences in and outside of Africa. He was also one-time senior vice president here at the African Development Bank. And of course, we had our guest speaker, very insightful presentation from Professor Stefan Dakum, from the Professor of Economic Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and Economics Department at Oxford University, and is also director of the Center for the Study of African Economics. And you saw he has published his book. You've got to go and read it. I saw on your messages, through your messages, some of you are already asking, where do they get the book? Please do get in touch with Professor Dakum. After this, he will tell you where to get it. Thank you so much for your time. I've been your moderator, Solomon Mugera, here at the bank, and I hope we can continue this conversation on Twitter, on other platforms, and see you again in future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Solomon. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Kevin. Chris. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Good. So we go to have a